Chapter 11, Westward Expansion. So we'll pick up in Chapter 11 with John Tyler assuming the role of president after William Henry Harrison has passed away. And then we'll look at some of the troubles that he experienced, primarily with him and Henry Clay. And then we'll look at how we expanded to the west, the question of Texas, what it was like to have the pioneer life, how we added California and Oregon, the next election, we'll look at the Mexican-American War, and then we'll end with a talk about how slavery began to divide the nation and the series of compromises that took place in order to prevent a war in 1850. Tyler's troubles. Just to backtrack for a second, we know in the previous election, which would have been the election of 1840, William Henry Harrison was elected by the Whigs to be president. And John Tyler was the vice president, and he wasn't really a Whig, he was more of an independent candidate. And so because Tyler was a states' rights Southerner and Clay was a hardcore nationalist who advocated the bank, protective tariffs, and federal improvements, he clashed with Tyler. And all of these three things here were advocated by Henry Clay, and they were things that caused division between Clay and Tyler. So Clay actually was really overbearing with John Tyler, which wasn't really like him, but historians think that because he wasn't chosen in the election of 1840, he was just really bitter, because even though he wasn't chosen as president, many people regarded him as the leader of the Whig Party. So that was an ego hit. And it's said that when he heard the news of Harrison's nomination, he was half drunk. And he said, "I am the most unfortunate man in the history of parties. Always run when sure to be defeated, and now betrayed for a nomination when I or anyone would be sure of an election." So he was really bitter about the election, and he kind of took that out on Tyler. And the issue that caused the most division between them was the bank. Henry Clay had this comprehensive program which included a new Bank of the United States, and obviously that conflicted with Tyler's view of states' rights. Nevertheless, Congress voted to pass the program, so Tyler vetoed the bill. And when he did, his entire cabinet, except for Daniel Webster, resigned. And so, abandoned by the Whigs, Tyler attempted to build a party of his own, but failed to do so. And historians think that the only reason that Daniel Webster stayed on was so that he could help settle the boundary between Maine and New Brunswick. So as it turns out, Daniel Webster did get to see the solution to the Maine border. And this was done through the Webster-Ashburton Treaty. I'm pretty sure that should say treaty there. And so this had remained unsettled since 1783. And in order to avoid a serious conflict over that area, Secretary of State Webster and Lord Ashburton of Great Britain negotiated a settlement. And although the United States gave up some of its rightful claims to that area, mostly on the northeastern coast, the British did make concessions elsewhere along the U.S.-Canadian border. So Webster successfully saw that through. So the question of Texas. The Transcontinental Treaty of 1819 had excluded Texas from the U.S., but Americans began to settle there nevertheless. And so Texas had become like an independent part of Mexico. And the Mexican government offered free land and local autonomy to settlers. So before long, American settlers who were free to practice slavery there far outnumbered the Mexicans who were in Texas. And both Adams and Jackson had tried to buy Texas, but Mexico refused to sell it. And Adams had offered $1 million for Texas, and Jackson had offered $5 million, but Mexico refused to sell that land or turn it over to the United States. So disagreements began to arise between the American settlers who were living in Texas and the Mexican government over things like religion and language and the issue of slavery, which led the Mexican government to put a stop on further immigration of Americans to Texas. The most pressing issue was that most of the American settlers living in Texas were Protestant, even though Mexican law required that they be Catholic. So in response to that, Texas began to seek independence from Mexico, and a series of skirmishes eventually escalated into a full-scale rebellion against the Mexican government. So the Mexican president, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, marched with 6,000 men to try to subdue the Texan rebels. And so he reached San Antonio, Texas in February of 1836, where a force of 187 Texans held the city under a guy named William B. Travis. And they were hiding behind the walls of a former mission. And missions were like religious outposts that had been set up by Catholic priests. And this was what was called the Alamo. So those 187 guys were hiding behind the walls of this Catholic mission. And for 10 days, they held their ground. But on March 6th, Santa Anna marched through and killed all of them, including those who were injured already. So on March 2nd, backtracking 4 days, Texas had declared its independence. So at San Jacinto River, Sam Houston took on a stand. And on April 21st, he was successfully able to defeat the Mexicans. So Sam Houston and his men achieved Texan independence. And this did not make them a part of the United States. It just made them separate from Mexico. And so Sam Houston was elected the first president of the Republic of Texas. Although opinion in Texas favored annexation by the United States, Jackson and Van Buren wanted neither war with Mexico nor to stir up sectional tensions by admitting Texas as a state. So Texas finally developed friendly relations with Britain, which began to alarm the Southerners, who worried that Texas might even abolish slavery. So in an effort to ensure the annexation of Texas, President Tyler appointed John C. Calhoun, Secretary of State once Daniel Webster resigned in 1843, to try to turn his fortunes around, because by this point he had pretty much alienated himself from the Whigs and the Democrats. The problem was that his appointment of John C. Calhoun was problematic because Calhoun was associated with the extreme Southern slaveholding viewpoint, and because of this, it alienated him from many Northerners who would have otherwise favored the annexation of Texas. So because it was Calhoun, the Senate rejected his treaty. Okay, so manifest destiny. This is simply the idea that Americans believed that it was their destiny, their God-ordained purpose to explore, settle, and exploit the entire continent and to unify it into one nation. And this idea became really popular by the 1840s, and it even shows up in artwork. And there's actually some artwork at the beginning of our chapter on page 300 and 301 that shows America as a woman. Our book says an eroticized and feminized woman because she is scantily clad, but she has a telegraph wire in one hand and like a textbook in the other, and she's just moving throughout the nation, taking over with her education and her telegraph wires. So this idea was really popular for the American public. Okay, so what was it like to be a pioneer? To engage in westward expansion. Later generations romanticized westward expansion and made it seem glorious and American, but in reality, the movement was nothing but hardship, danger, and so often death. And usually that either came through lack of sanitation, or Indian attacks, or wild animals ravaging through the camp, running out of food and water, dysentery, there was no place to sleep. So all of these things made a really difficult situation for those who were pioneers and were moving westward to fill in this great American continent. So in the 1840s, the trip west covered a longer distance than in earlier days. So this was a longer trip. It was a harder trip because many of the comforts of quote-unquote civilization were more extensive than in the earlier days. We talked about, I believe in the last chapter, how middle-class Americans tried to emulate this aristocratic lifestyle by being consumers, consuming material possessions. So when they had to give those up and move westward, it was harder for them. So the move west also disrupted family life and gender roles, and a lot of the hardship fell on women. And there was this one woman who left a diary behind about her experiences on the frontier, and she said, "I keep close to my gun and my dog." And so between that and collecting dried buffalo dung for fuel, caring for infants in a wagon for weeks and weeks at a time with no place to sleep, made this move really hard. This is not something to be romanticized, really. So lastly, the addition of California and Oregon. Many settlers had traveled to California and then unmistakably part of Mexico and to Oregon, which both the United States and the British claimed. So in the 1840s, Americans regarded Oregon as a particularly desirable destination. Unfortunately, the expense of the trip meant that few who went west were genuinely poor. Many of them were well off enough to sustain themselves for the weeks that it took to travel there. But the allure of the Pacific coast harbors of California and Oregon drew people. And some regarded that as the key to Asian trade, and was another reason that people went westward.